So we can see it now.
Yep, all good.
Great. Thank you. Well, you don't need me to remind you that at this time of year, we would normally expect the image on the left, enjoying beautiful sunny weather, students on campus, maybe after assessments, and strong, engaged learning communities, perhaps reflecting on the year. So not only are we all online, but we're enjoying maybe the worst May in Scotland for at least the last 40 years. So as I say, it's well known in the literature, the significant advantages in strong learning communities. That sense of belonging has a serious impact on our students' retention, their connection with their peers, and their attainment. And of course, as I say, 14 months ago, we had to move, because of the pandemic, extremely rapidly to this pivot point to emergency remote learning. And I use that phrase deliberately rather than online teaching. And so now we were even talking about this just a few minutes ago, this whole etiquette of online teaching, and even cameras on, cameras off. And it's been a real challenge for all of us about how can we replicate that sort of face-to-face strong learning communities in an online environment. And as I say, I think there's a number of tactics that we can employ, and I really want to sort of talk in more detail. First of all, I suppose at an institutional level, what institutions have been doing and how we can promote engaged learning communities in the classroom, so an academic environment. But then also I want to talk about student-led learning communities as well. So that will touch on sort of more the society and academic representation. The aim of this talk is really to give you a bit of an overview and sort of kick the discussions off before we move into the more detailed talks and discussions throughout the day. But I felt I couldn't give a talk without going on about my particular hobby horse, as some of you know, is about these tangible assets. And a couple of years ago, I was very lucky to lead a project with two of my colleagues, Professor Elizabeth Cleaver and Dr. Fiona Smart, on a QA-funded project that was pre-COVID. And it was entitled Beyond the Metrics, and you'll see the link at the bottom there. And it was really interesting, and as I say, preparing for this talk and reflecting in the last 14 months, that actually, when we went out to the sector and we spoke to a whole range of academic staff, student representatives, vice principals, these were, say, the top 5 intangible assets of a higher education experience. And when I talk about intangible assets, these are things which we deemed were important, but aren't easily measurable by metrics, but as I say, are really, really important when it comes to a higher education experience, and actually factors which impact very significantly on what I've just been talking about: student retention, student attainment. So as I say, that whole sense of belonging, academic community, the relationships between staff members and students themselves, the wider impact of a higher education experience. So it's not just about academic achievement. There's a huge amount there around sort of wider personal development and resilience and etc. Well-being of our staff and students, and clearly student engagement and participation. And as I say, when I was reflecting on these intangible assets are absolutely critical when we think about successful digital learning communities. And there is no doubt in my mind that the institutions which are going to be successful going forward are those institutions which manage a successful intangible asset, so enable to retain these intangible assets in a digital and blended environment. So talking first of all, I suppose, about my own institution. So Glasgow Caledonian, I started back in April 2020. In fact, I've only been on the campus 3 times in the last 13 months. So that in itself has been quite a challenge. So I've been very reliant on trying to build relationships and myself using this digital medium. Glasgow Caledonian took this strategic approach, which we encompassed under the phrase going digital, and we developed a series of principles for digital learning, and then there were 4 enabling pillars. One was developing some guidance for quality and standards of digital learning, because we wanted consistency across the institution. And we developed some various baseline standards, as well as obviously examples of good practice and leading practice as well. We developed, we agreed a number of key tools that we would use to support digital learning. That's not to preclude perhaps staff using additional tools, but we needed a core set of tools that would be supported by the institution and key learning platforms. There was a huge amount of work, which I'll talk about in a moment, around building digital learning capabilities of our staff, but obviously of our students as well. And finally, the fourth enabling pillar was our evaluation strategy. So if I talk first of all, just very briefly about supporting our staff to support our students, well, clearly there's a wealth of resources out there, but we were recognizing that we were taking on-campus provision and adapting it for this, for the pandemic, for this move to emergency remote teaching. We weren't designing online and blended programs from scratch. We spent a huge amount of time, as I say, developing resources for staff, doing very practical examples of sharing practice through various webinars, case studies. We've got a blog that's available as well. And number 4, the Digital Leads Network. This was really important. So every department in the university nominated an academic champion, and they would be I suppose their role was, first of all, to inform the university, to help us with innovations, and to act as a bit of a champion and as a bridge between the centre and the department and their colleagues. And I think this approach is probably quite similar to a number of the other universities in Scotland and indeed the rest of the UK. And just to give some examples on good practice, so we've created this portal called Going Digital Insights, and there's a raft of, it's a developing set of case studies and examples of practice, and we're using some multimedia, so it's not just written case studies, but we're looking at videos, we're looking at interviews, we're looking at blogs. There's a raft of sort of technologies that we are using. And it was really interesting. I sort of asked a few of my colleagues in the sector to give examples of what they were doing for this talk. And this is an example. I'm very grateful to my colleagues at Edinburgh Napier University. And there was a lot of familiarity. Their initiative, rather than going digital, was called the Digital Support Partnership. But again, you'll see there about the academic development activities that they were undertaking, the subject group representatives, the principles for online learning and teaching. So there's a lot of similarities there, obviously contextualized for the institution, but an awful lot of similarities to the approach that we took at Glasgow Caledonian University. And again, very grateful to this slide, which is from one of my very talented colleagues at Edinburgh Napier, Katrina Swanton, who you probably know. She does a lot of these incredibly visual infographics. So there's the 12 principles of learning and teaching at Edinburgh Napier. So sort of moving on, I suppose, online socialization was a great challenge for all of us, and this links in with my initial points that I made at the beginning of the talk. And at Glasgow Caledonian, it was one of my colleagues, Fiona Kennedy, who leads the postgraduate certificate in academic practice, who developed these so-called 8 strategies for online socialization. And really, these are about how do we make that connection? How do we make this connection between staff and students, and between the students themselves in an online environment? And you'll see there that we've tried to sort of think about opportunities for social interaction. So even just really, really simple things like making sure that, say, the lecture starts at 5 past the hour and finishes at 5 to the hour. Make sure that, encourage students to have their cameras on and have a bit of informal chit chat. I find that works better in small groups. It's quite difficult if there's a large lecture, maybe 100 students online, to try and get students to interact. And of course, I suppose with the whole, going back to the whole camera on, camera off, we need to respect individual students' sort of privacy concerns, but at the same time, we get a lot of report from students feeling quite isolated in the online environment, and they don't have that disconnect. They've never actually met other students in their class. And so actually they really welcome opportunity to engage with their colleagues and, as I say, build those relationships, which is not easy in an online environment. So one of the other things that Glasgow Caledonian has done is we've created this one-stop shop called GCU Getting Online. This is everything from sort of helping our students to be effective online learners. It's resources around well-being. We're developing them around, we're also got a module on cyber security. We've got a raft of things around digital accessibility. Obviously there was the legislation came in last year, and that has been quite a challenge for institutions about ensuring that all online materials are accessible. And as I say, that for me has been absolutely critical about getting our students to be comfortable and effective online learners. And again, I sort of went out to the sector and asked a couple of people what they were doing for examples of student-led activities. So these are just some of the examples from Glasgow Caledonian, but other universities as well. So basically they're kind of categorized into a few sort of different themes, one around that whole notion of peer support buddy systems, and they have various degrees of formality. So at Glasgow Caledonian, we have PALS, which is peer assisted learning support, and that is quite a sort of a formal system. And then there are also a raft of tools. Again, I can't say that I've used GatherTown or Wonder.me, but I know my colleagues in the Student Association have been using them to various success. And I think these are developing all the time, and that is a challenge that I will return to in a moment. Other sort of examples, looking at things like book clubs or quizzes. Again, they might be subject-based, so that might be, for example, in English literature or in social science, sociology, or they might be more general. We also have other things, novel things like yoga classes using mixed pose. I don't know if anyone has tried this. I haven't, but I did have a look. It looked quite interesting. Heard about online dance classes, etc. So there's a raft of things there around sort of socialization, but also some disciplinary discipline-specific activities as well. And then clearly there's a raft of social media tools that we use to sort of keep in touch with our students, support their well-being, promote the sort of support services which are on offer. And then finally, I couldn't round off the slide without having Pet of the Week. So again, just that notion of sharing positive feeling, mental health, and we're all in it together, and providing that sort of mutual support for colleagues through this very challenging time. So I wanted to sort of conclude with a couple of slides from the Student Association, because I asked the Student Association what their reflections were over the last 14 months. And I guess these were some of the positives. I think, first of all, this whole notion of student-centeredness and community-led decisions around what tech tools might be best for them. And that sometimes creates a little bit of a tension with our institutional platforms. So if I just focus, for example, on Twitch or Discourse, you know, these tools are quite popular, particularly around, say, our computer games students. But I don't think that all student communities are necessarily familiar with these tools. So again, I think there's that, it doesn't need to be either or. So if we focus on the computer gamers, if they want to use Twitch for their academic societies, that's fine, but we're not saying that, so we're not saying it's a one size fits all. And the platforms that we use have to be fit for purpose, but also familiar to the community that we are supporting. I think one really interesting thing was the Student Association noticed that the demographics was quite different in the digital environment. So particularly communities which have been quite hard to reach for the Student Association in the past, such as maybe more mature learners, part-time learners, they were actually really quite engaged through the digital environment. Whereas maybe our sort of, maybe let's call it more of our core student body, they actually found them quite difficult to reach in the online environment. So it was quite interesting that there's an opportunity, I suppose, for how we can get that blend going forward so that we can engage all of our students through the various media that we have available to us now. Third point was, well, I guess the geographical barriers to communication and collaboration are effectively nil. What's really interesting now is that we found that, you know, we're having international speakers come from all over the world, deliver, whether that's in class or say through the various student societies. We've certainly found that, you know, it's as easy to be on a call with my colleagues in GCU London or GCU New York or other parts of the world as it is to be with my colleagues in my team in Glasgow. So geographical barriers have been reduced, if not eliminated. And I think, again, a lot of students really like the flexibility of that combination of synchronous and asynchronous. Getting that balance is really difficult, and probably, again, one size doesn't fit all because we all have personal preferences. So that's quite a challenge, but certainly having that combination of synchronous and asynchronous has been welcomed. And I think finally, the point here around online collaboration is not inferior. You know, it's not the same, but there are a growing number of digital tools, and I've just highlighted there Padlet or Mentimeter or even Jamboard, that are able to either replicate or augment face-to-face practice. So we're just having to think about things differently, and functionality and new tools are occurring all the time. And that is one of the challenges. It is really hard to keep up with the evolving tech and the different platforms. Microsoft Teams almost seems to change on a weekly basis. And I think all of us can relate to this notion of digital fatigue as well. I think one of the other points is this whole notion around organic, spontaneous engagement. You know, if we were all on campus, we might just say, oh, do you want to go for a coffee? Or should we meet in the bar? Or, you know, it spins off lots of conversations. Whereas in the online only environment, it needs to be more structured. It needs to be more organized. And I think that can be a little bit of a challenge. Diversity of preferences, as I've said, we're all individuals. It's very difficult to generalize groups of students, and that can be quite challenging to accommodate those diversity of preferences and learning styles. And then finally, and I suppose this relates to my comments again about platforms, Twitch or others which are favored by individual communities, is that there's not always compatibility or indeed the necessary technical integrations between institutional platforms and communities' preferred tools. So finally, my final slide, I suppose this is the challenge for all of us, is how can we achieve the best of both worlds? You know, we want to have a blended experience. I think it's really exciting. It offers lots of opportunities for more personalized experiences. I think we're at Glasgow Caledonian are looking at the so-called HighFlex teaching. So that's where you might be able to support students in the classroom and simultaneously those online, again, giving students greater choice about how they access and engage with their learning. But we need to think very carefully about what's the future of our estate, and do we have the digital systems, processes, infrastructure to support this, to realize our vision. And then finally, I suppose that with the move to digital, then actually we have become very much a global higher education sector. And that means, whether we like it or not, and I know this is maybe not the kind of phraseology that we talk about with Scottish higher education, but it is increasingly competitive because we are operating in that digital space. And as I've said already, digital space knows no geographical boundaries. So happy to take any questions, or indeed we can follow up in the discussions, but thank you all very much for listening. And I'm now going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Alastair. Really amazing talk. I definitely see a blog post in the works. Lots of institutions will definitely benefit from those lessons learned, the challenges, the strategies for online socialization. Loved the pet of the week. We actually get a weekly reminder of one of our staff, Sean, if you're watching this, his hedgehog, which is always lovely to see. So we will take some questions because we have some extra time, but if we don't have a chance to come to you, please put them in the Padlet and we'll come to them later. So first question from Nicholas. Peer-to-peer support between students happens organically in a face-to-face environment. Since remote working is here to stay, what's the best way to create a blended environment where peer-to-peer support can happen organically? And also in the current climate, should a vibrant class environment where peer-to-peer support can happen be seen as mental health prevention?
Okay, so I think to answer the last point first, absolutely. It is critical, mental health and well-being, but I think it's that notion of respecting us all as individuals as well, and personal preference. And so I think that's where flexibility and choice for me becomes so important. And as I say, I think if we look at those principles around synchronous and asynchronous delivery, and also looking at technology such as HighFlex, where we can provide students with choice for how they choose to engage with their learning. Now, clearly, this depends a little bit on the modules, Alex, because, if we've got a science module that's all focused on laboratory techniques, then actually then one really has to attend the laboratory. But certainly when we're thinking about workshops, tutorials, and definitely lectures, then I think there's lots of opportunities. So for me, it's really about choice, flexibility, and promotion of students' engagement in a multiple number of ways. Those are for me all absolutely key.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Our next question. First, some praise. These resources look fantastic. What sort of feedback did you get from academic staff? Were they able to engage, and what was their input?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we received really good feedback from the academic staff, which was, I think there was a huge amount of work certainly from my colleagues, from the learning technologists. But as I said, I think from the academic staff themselves. And I think that's where, for example, our digital leads network was so successful, because they were sort of obviously natural innovators. They were, as I suppose, the converted who were really engaged in technology enhanced learning before the pandemic, but they've also been supporting their colleagues. And I think that's what's been absolutely brilliant. If I take something like our business school, they operate this sort of brown bag lunch, where staff will come in, and it's sort of a combination of sharing good practice, but it's also a clinic, so people can sort of share, well, these are my challenges, and has anyone got any good ideas about how you can help me with sort of X, Y, and Z. So there's been plenty of opportunity for staff to get involved, and that's something we're really keen on. And that's why I say those digital insights, it's a growing library of resources, because again, it's an obvious point, but we're on the journey. None of us have got this solved. As I say, we had to take campus-based programs and develop them for an online environment in a fortnight. Now we're obviously far more advanced than that now, but I think now is the time that actually we're taking that longer term view, and we are able to sort of step back and say, well, actually, given this context, given we're committed to a blended student experience, how can we optimize this so that we can get the best of both worlds? Because I think that for me is the greatest challenge.
Definitely. I think it's so interesting to hear, both students and staff have really needed that peer to support, even both sides having the clinics. It'll be interesting to see just how many staff and who in terms of staff become the new and next generation of innovation champions. So thank you so much for your presentation and your talk. It was really fantastic and illuminating.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Our pleasure.